The drought maker's daughter. The well was dry again. Elias Kane stood at the edge of the stone lip, staring down into nothing. No glimmer, no smell of moisture, just dust and the echo of a pebble he dropped, rattling against rock that should have been wet. The August sun pressed down on his shoulders like a hand trying to push him into the ground. Somewhere behind him, the last 24 head of cattle lowed in voices that sounded less like animals and more like people praying. He pulled the bucket rope through his cracked palms and let it coil at his boots. 38 years old, and his hands looked 60. The war had started the damage. 4 years scouting for the 7th Cavalry across territories that had no name on any map. And the ranch had finished it. 12 years of fence posts, branding irons, and Wyoming wind that stripped skin the way a river strips stone. He didn't curse. He'd stopped cursing the day Anna died, 5 years back, as though God might be listening and might take something else. Pa? The screen door creaked behind him. Pa, how bad? He turned. Nettie stood on the porch in her 2 big boots, squinting against the glare. 12 years old, thin as a fence rail, brown hair tied back with a strip of calico. She had her mother's eyes, gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and her mother's way of asking questions she already knew the answer to. Bad enough, he said. She nodded once, like a grown woman agreeing to terms. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. Hit subscribe and follow this story to the very end. Trust me, you won't regret it. The girl arrived on foot in the 3rd week of the drought, walking up the ranch road with a canvas bag over one shoulder and dust on her boots up to the ankle. Elias saw her from the barn, where he was rationing hay he couldn't afford. At first, he thought she was a boy. Short, barely over 5 feet, dressed in men's trousers and a sun-faded shirt buttoned to the throat. Then she took off her hat and dark hair spilled to her shoulders, and he saw the face beneath. Young, sharp-boned, brown from weather. Not pretty the way the catalog said women should be pretty. Pretty the way a hawk is pretty, built for something. She stopped at the gate and waited, didn't call out, didn't wave, just stood there with her chin lifted, watching him with steady dark eyes like she had all the patience in the territory and intended to use it. Elias walked over slowly. He had a rifle in the barn and a revolver on his hip, and he put his hand near neither. Something about the way she stood told him she'd notice. "Help you?" he said. "I'm looking for work." Her voice was clear and low, with an accent he couldn't quite place. Somewhere east of the mountains, maybe further. "I heard in town your ranch hand quit." Ranch hand didn't quit. Ranch hand stole a horse and left in the night. He studied her. She couldn't weigh. She, more than 110 pounds, soaking wet. "You know ranch work?" "I know how to work." She met his eyes without blinking. "I can mend fence. I can feed stock. I can cook if you need it, though I won't pretend to be good at it. I don't drink, I don't steal, and I don't quit when things get hard. Things are hard. I noticed. Your creek beds dry a 1/4 mile back, and your cattle sound like they haven't had proper water in a week." She tilted her head. "That's why I'm here, Mr. Kane. Not because things are easy." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind pushed dust between them in a slow spiral. "What's your name?" "Wren Lockhart." "How old are you, Wren Lockhart?" 19. He almost sent her away. She was too young, too small, too much like the kind of trouble that drifted into frontier towns and left wreckage behind. But something in her stance, feet planted, shoulders square, like she'd been told no 1,000 times and had learned to stand through it, reminded him of Anna. Not the look, the iron underneath. "There's a bunkhouse behind the barn," he said. "Roof leaks. Pays $2 a week in meals. If the drought breaks, I'll make it 4. I'll take it." She picked up her bag and walked past him without another word. He noticed she didn't thank him, and he respected that. Nettie watched the new woman from behind the kitchen curtain for 3 days before she spoke to her. She watched Wren rise before dawn and haul water from the dwindling spring in buckets she could barely lift. Watched her mend the south pasture fence with hands that bled by noon and kept working until dark. Watched her eat her supper on the bunkhouse steps alone, scraping the tin plate clean, then sit in the failing light with her knees drawn up, staring at the hills like she was reading something written there. On the 4th morning, Nettie brought coffee to the bunkhouse porch. "You don't have to do that," Wren said. "I know." Nettie sat down on the step beside her. "Where'd you come from?" "Broken Ridge. It's a mining camp up near—" "I know where it is. Mama used to say nothing good came out of Broken Ridge except the road leaving it." Something flickered across Wren's face, almost a smile. "Your mama was right. You got family there?" "No." "You got family anywhere?" Wren looked at her. The morning light caught the faintest scar along her jaw, thin and white, like a thread pulled through skin. "No." Nettie considered this with the gravity of someone who understood loss. "Me and Pa lost Mama when I was 7, she said. "Typhoid. Pa doesn't talk about it, but he keeps her shawl folded in his bureau drawer, and sometimes I see him holding it at night when he thinks I'm asleep." Wren was quiet. "I'm telling you that because I think you know what it's like," Nettie said, "to lose people." Wren wrapped both hands around the tin cup and said nothing for a long time. Then, "I never had people to lose. I was left at a mission when I was a baby. The nuns raised me until I was 10. Then the mission closed, and I went to the mining camp, worked in the cookhouse, tried once to answer a mail-order bride advertisement when I was 17. Her mouth tightened. "The man took one look at me and said he'd ordered a woman, not a child, sent me back on the next stage. That's terrible. That's life on the frontier." Wren took a sip of coffee. "But I'm still here. That counts for something." Nettie studied her with those sage-colored eyes, and whatever she saw satisfied her. "Yes," she said, "it does." In the evenings, Wren earned her place in the quiet ways that mattered most. She fixed the hinge on the barn door that had been squealing since spring. She re-chinked the gaps in the bunkhouse wall where the wind came through like a blade. She found the source of the leak in the kitchen roof, a cracked shingle hidden under a mat of dried leaves, and patched it with pine tar and a piece of flattened tin from the scrap pile. Each repair was small, but together they changed the feel of the place. The ranch stopped groaning. It started holding. Elias noticed, though he didn't say much. He was a man who'd built his whole adult life on silence. Silence in the cavalry, where a scout who talked got men killed. Silence in marriage, where Anna had understood his wordlessness better than any speech. Silence in grief, which was the only language loss respected. But he watched Wren work, and something in the watching unsettled him. Not distrust, something deeper, the discomfort of seeing someone carry weight you'd been carrying alone. One evening, he found Wren on the porch, oiling a harness that had gone stiff from neglect. The sunset had turned the sky the color of rusted iron, and the heat still pressed down even as the light died. "You don't rest much," he said. "Neither do you." He leaned against the porch post. That's different. This is my place. She didn't look up. From the leather. Every place I've ever been, I've had to earn the right to stay. I don't know how to stop doing that. The words hung in the hot air. He wanted to say something. That she'd already earned it. That the right to stay wasn't something you paid for day by day. But the words wouldn't come. And by the time they might have, she'd moved on to the next buckle. Nettie, meanwhile, had attached herself to Wren with the tenacity of a burr on wool. She followed her through the morning chores, asking questions about the mining camp, what the mountains looked like, whether she'd ever seen a bear, how cold it got in winter. Wren answered each question carefully, choosing words the way she chose stones for the fence, testing each one for weight and fit. Did anyone ever take care of you? Nettie asked one morning while they mucked out the horse stalls. The nuns tried. They weren't unkind. But there were 40 children and 6 sisters, and kindness stretched thin over, that many heads doesn't feel like kindness anymore. It feels like rationing. Nettie was quiet for a moment, pitchfork still. Then she said, "You can have some of mine. I've got extra." Wren's hands stopped moving. She looked at the girl. This 12-year-old with her mother's eyes and her father's backbone, and a heart that opened where most people's closed. And for the first time since she'd walked up the ranch road, her eyes went bright with something she couldn't blink away. She cleared her throat. "Thank you, Nettie." "You're welcome." Nettie went back to mucking as if she'd just offered salt for the stew. The water situation grew worse. Elias rode the creek line 3 miles upstream and found what he'd feared. Ambrose Redfield, who owned the Redfield Cattle Company and controlled most of the valley from his stone house on the ridge, had built a diversion dam across the main channel. Nothing grand, just enough timber and earth to choke the flow and send it west, toward his own grazing land. The creek that had fed the Kane Ranch for 12 years was now a damp trough of mud and dying crawfish. Elias stood in his stirrups and stared at the dam, and something cold settled in his chest. He'd known Redfield for years. A big man with a short beard and a voice that filled rooms the way smoke fills rooms. You breathed it whether you wanted to or not. He'd been buying up land along the valley for a decade, and the ranches that wouldn't sell had a way of failing. Fences cut, stock scattered, and now water stolen. When Elias rode into town and brought the matter to the county office, the clerk, a pale young man named Spivey, looked at his hands and said, "Mr. Redfield has filed a water claim with the territorial authority. He's within his rights, Mr. Kane." Since when does a man have the right to steal another man's water? Spivey's eyes darted to the window. Since the man has a lawyer and you don't. Elias left the office with his jaw set so hard his teeth ached. It was Wren who found the spring. She'd been walking the hills behind the ranch every evening after supper, and Elias hadn't asked why. He figured she needed space, the way animals that have been caged need space. But one evening she came back with mud on her boots up to the knee and a look on her face he hadn't seen before. Alive, electric, like something had caught fire behind her eyes. "There's water," she said. 2 miles northeast, up in the draw behind the sandstone ridge. A spring line running under the rock. I could smell it before I found it. The ground was wet 50 yards before the source. "How'd you know to look there?" "Mining camp." She said it simply, the way she said everything. "The prospectors used to pay me a nickel to track springs for them. Water's more valuable than gold when you're living in the mountains. You learn to read the ground, the color of the rock, where the cottonwoods grow thickest, where the insects gather at dusk. She paused. That spring feeds underground. I followed the wet ground and the mineral deposits. It comes out in a seep on your northeast boundary, and it runs clean. Elias stared at her. Mr. Kane, if you dig a channel from that spring to your stock pond, you don't need the creek. You don't need Redfield's permission. You don't need anything from that man at all. Nettie, who had been listening from the doorway, let out a whoop that startled the barn cat off the porch rail. They dug for 5 days. Elias cut the channel with a pickaxe while Wren worked behind him with a spade, clearing earth and shoring the sides with flat stones she carried from the ridge. Nettie hauled rocks and kept water boiling for the coffee that was the only thing keeping them upright by the 3rd day. The sun was relentless. The soil fought them. Wren's hands cracked and bled through the wrapping she'd made from a torn shirt, and she didn't stop. On the evening of the 5th day, they broke through the last shelf of sandstone, and water, cold, clear, sweet-smelling water, surged into the channel and began its slow, deliberate path downhill toward the stock pond. Nettie dropped to her knees and put her hands in it. "It's real," she said, her voice cracking. "Pa, it's real." Elias looked at his daughter kneeling in the mud with water running between her fingers, and then he looked at Wren, who stood leaning on the spade with her dark hair plastered to her forehead and blood on her palms. She wasn't smiling. She was watching the water the way a mother watches a child take its first steps, fierce, silent, terrified it might stop. Something shifted in his chest, not the cold thing, something warmer. "Thank you," he said. She met his eyes. "Don't thank me yet." Wren was right not to accept gratitude early. On the 7th day, 3 riders came up the ranch road at dusk. Elias recognized the front man, Garrett Polk, Redfield's foreman, a lean, sun-darkened man with a drooping mustache and eyes the color of old pennies. Behind him rode 2 men Elias didn't know, but the rifles across their saddles spoke clearly enough. "Evening, Kane," Polk said, not dismounting. "Mr. Redfield sent me to have a conversation." Elias stood on the porch with his hand near his belt. "Talk." "Mr. Redfield's noticed you've been doing some digging on the northeast boundary. He wants to remind you that water rights in this valley are under territorial review, and any unauthorized diversion could be considered. That spring's on my land." Elias's voice was flat. "I checked the survey markers myself." "Survey markers move." Polk smiled. It was not a friendly expression. "Mr. Redfield is prepared to make you a fair offer for the property, 20 cents on the dollar. Given the drought, that's generous." "Given the drought your boss manufactured, I'd say it's robbery." Polk's smile faded. He leaned forward in the saddle. "Mr. Redfield doesn't manufacture anything, Kane. He's a businessman. And businessmen don't take kindly to people who make their business difficult." His eyes moved to the house, where the kitchen light glowed yellow through the curtain. "You've got a daughter in there. Think about that." He turned his horse and rode back down the road with his men behind him, and the dust settled slowly in the dark. That night, Wren sat at the kitchen table across from Elias, while Nettie slept. The lamp between them threw their shadows long against the wall. "He's going to come for this place," Wren said quietly. "I've seen men like him. In Broken Ridge, there was a mine boss named Hargrove who did the same thing, choked off the water, bought out the claims for nothing, and anyone who refused." She didn't finish. "I'm not leaving my land." "I know." She folded her hands on the table. Her knuckles were raw. "But you need more than a spring and a rifle. You need proof that he diverted the creek illegally. If his dam was built before he filed that water claim, The claim is fraudulent. The territorial authority would have to investigate. And how do I prove that? I tracked water for prospectors. I can track it backward too. Her eyes were steady. The dam site, the timber he used, the earth he moved. Trees don't lie. Cut marks tell you when a tree was felled. Soil displacement tells you how long a dam's been sitting. I can read those signs the way you read a cavalry map. Give me 2 days. He looked at her for a long time. This small young woman with her scarred jaw and her mining camp education and her hands that never stopped working. He thought about Anna, who had been soft where Ren was hard, gentle where Ren was sharp, but who had shared the same unbreakable thing at the center, the refusal to let the world take what mattered. It's dangerous, he said. Everything worth doing out here is dangerous. He almost smiled. You sound like my wife. I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Kane. Nettie's voice came from the hallway, sleepy and certain. It is one. Ren left before dawn and was gone for 2 days. Elias didn't sleep well either night, though he couldn't have said whether it was worry about Redfield or worry about her. Both, he supposed. The two anxieties had become tangled together, somewhere in the digging of that channel, in the sight of her bloody hands still gripping the spade. On the first night, he sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the road. Nettie came out and sat beside him without speaking. After a while, she leaned her head against his arm, and he put his hand on her hair, and they stayed like that until the stars wheeled overhead and the coyotes sang their high, thin songs from the ridge. She'll come back, Nettie said. I know. You're worried. I'm cautious. There's a difference. Nettie made a sound that was almost a laugh. No, there isn't. Not with you. She was right. He was worried. Not the general worry of a man with troubles. He'd had that for years, carried it like a stone in his pocket. But the specific, sharp-edged worry of a man who has realized he has something new to lose. It was a feeling he'd sworn he'd never allow again. And here it was, uninvited, settling into his chest like a bird into a nest it had built without permission. The second night was worse. A rider passed on the road after midnight, just a shadow and hoofbeats, there and gone. And Elias stood in the dark with his hand on the revolver and his heart hammering until the sound faded. It was probably nothing. A traveler. A cowhand heading home late. But the frontier taught you that probably nothing was the phrase that preceded most disasters, and he didn't sleep again until the eastern sky began to gray. She came back on the second evening, filthy and exhausted, carrying a leather satchel filled with what she'd gathered, sketches of the dam's construction showing green timber, freshly cut, not seasoned, soil samples from the diversion channel with root growth that proved the dam was older than Redfield's water claim by at least a season, and her own detailed notes, written in a precise hand that surprised Elias, documenting the mineral traces that showed the creek's original course. He built that dam last spring, Ren said, spreading her evidence across the kitchen table. Before the drought even started. He planned this, Mr. Kane. He choked off the water to drive you out, then filed the claim to make it look legal. Elias studied the sketches and the samples and the notes, and he felt something rise in him that he hadn't felt since Anna died. Not anger. He'd had plenty of that. Something cleaner. Purpose. I'll take this to the territorial judge in Casper, he said. Redfield will try to stop you. Let him try. Ren looked at him across the lamplight. I'm going with you. No. Yes. She said it without heat, without argument. Just fact. Someone needs to stay and explain this evidence to the judge in terms he'll understand. I know water. I know rock. I know how to prove what I'm saying with my hands in the dirt. You know how to look a man in the eye and not flinch." She tilted her head. "We need both." Nettie appeared in the doorway again, fully dressed, her mother's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "I'm coming too," she said. "Nettie, Pa, this is our home." He looked at his daughter, standing there in Anna's shawl with her jaw set and her sage green eyes burning, and he looked at Wren, who watched him with that hawk's patience, and he understood something that had been growing in him for weeks, quietly, the way water moves underground before it breaks the surface. These were his people. This strange, fierce young woman who had walked out of nowhere and refused to leave. This daughter who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a courage all her own. Family wasn't always blood. Sometimes it was the people who stayed when everything told them to run. "All right," he said. "We ride at dawn." The ride to Casper took a day and a half. They traveled light, Elias on his bay gelding, Wren on the ranch's remaining horse, a stocky gray mare that Nettie had named Cloud in a fit of childhood optimism. Nettie rode behind her father, her arms around his waist, Anna's shawl folded in the saddlebag. They camped the first night in a shallow draw beside a creek that still had water. Wren had picked the spot by reading the trees, the same way she read everything. Elias built a small fire while Wren made coffee and hardtack. Nettie lay on her bedroll and looked up at the stars, which were thick and cold and endless in the Wyoming sky. "Wren?" Nettie's voice was small in the dark. "Yes? What if the judge doesn't believe us?" Wren was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When I was in the mining camp, the cookhouse boss used to short our rations and blame it on the supply wagons. Everyone knew he was lying, but nobody could prove it. One day, I started keeping count. Every barrel that came in, every meal that went out. Took me 3 months. When I showed the numbers to the mine superintendent, the boss was gone by morning." "And the superintendent believed you?" "He believed the numbers. Numbers don't lie, and neither does dirt." Wren poked the fire with a stick. Sparks rose and vanished against the stars. "The truth is in what I brought, Nettie. The timber, the soil, the mineral traces. All the judge has to do is look." Elias listened from the other side of the fire and said nothing, but something in his silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of a man holding the world at arm's length. It was the silence of a man listening, really listening, to the voice of someone he trusted. The hearing in Casper took 3 hours. Redfield came with a lawyer in a black suit who spoke in paragraphs and referenced statutes that sounded impressive until the territorial judge, a silver-haired man named Harlan Cooper, who had spent 30 years settling disputes in a land where disputes often ended in gunfire, asked Wren Lockhart to present her evidence. She stood before the bench in her work clothes, her boots still carrying ranch dust, and she laid it out with the precision of a surveyor and the certainty of someone who had learned to read the earth because her survival depended on it. She explained the timber cuts, the root growth, the mineral traces. She drew diagrams on a sheet of brown paper. She spoke clearly, without hesitation, and when Redfield's lawyer objected, she waited for him to finish and then continued as if he hadn't spoken. Elias watched from the gallery and felt something crack open in his chest that he'd kept sealed for 5 years. Judge Cooper ruled in favor of the Kane Ranch. The dam was to be removed within 10 days. Redfield's water claim was revoked pending investigation. And the territorial authority would conduct a full review of Redfield's land acquisitions in the valley. Redfield's face went the color of old brick. He leaned across the aisle and hissed at Elias, "This isn't over, Kane." Elias looked at him steadily. "For you it is." The dam came down on a Tuesday in September, and by Wednesday morning, the creek was running again. Wren heard it before she saw it, a sound like whispering, then like laughter, then like something alive remembering how to breathe. She walked to the creek bank and stood there, watching the water find its old path, filling the cracks, darkening the stones, moving with the quiet certainty of something that had always known where it belonged. Nettie came running from the house and threw her arms around Wren's waist so hard she nearly knocked her over. Elias followed more slowly, the way he did everything, deliberate, careful, as though the world might break if he moved too fast. He stood beside Wren at the creek bank. Their shoulders were close but not touching. "You should stay," he said. "Is that an offer or an order?" "It's a question." He looked at her. The morning light softened the hard lines of his face, and she saw what Nettie must see, what Anna had seen, the tenderness he kept buried under years of loss and silence and Wyoming wind. "Stay, Wren. Not as a ranch hand, as part of this." She looked at the water, then at Nettie, then at the hills where she'd found the spring, then back at him. The scar on her jaw caught the light. "I've never been part of anything," she said quietly. "I know." His voice was rough. "Neither have I. Not since Anna." Something passed between them, not words, not a touch, but something as real as the water running over the stones. An agreement made in silence, the way the best agreements on the frontier were made. "All right," she said. "I'll stay." Nettie, who had been watching with the sharp eyes she'd inherited from her mother and the stubborn hope she'd built on her own, smiled so wide it changed her whole face. She grabbed Wren's hand and Elias's hand and held them together, and for a moment, the three of them stood at the edge of the running creek with the sun on their faces, and the land breathed around them, and the drought was over, in more ways than one. Epilogue. Years later, when Nettie was grown and had her own place up the valley, she would tell people the story of the drought and the woman who walked up the ranch road with a canvas bag and a stubborn jaw and saved everything. "She was the smallest person I ever met," Nettie would say, "and the strongest." By then, the spring Wren had found still ran clear behind the sandstone ridge, and the channel they dug together had become a permanent feature of the land, lined with cottonwoods that Wren had planted the first autumn. Elias and Wren had married in October of that year, in the yard between the house and the barn, with Judge Cooper officiating and Nettie standing as witness and the creek singing behind them all. Redfield's empire crumbled under the territorial investigation. 3 other ranchers came forward with evidence of stolen water and manipulated claims. By spring, he was gone from the valley, and the land he'd tried to swallow was free again. But Nettie never told that part of the story first. She always started with the same image: a young woman standing at the gate in the August heat, short and dust-covered and alone, with eyes like a hawk's and hands that were already reaching for work. She didn't ask for charity, Nettie would say. She didn't ask for love. She asked for the chance to be useful, and then she made herself indispensable. She'd pause then, the way her father used to pause, letting the silence say what words couldn't. Family isn't who you're born to. It's who you dig ditches with when the world goes dry. If this story warmed your spirit, please like this video and share it with someone who loves a true frontier romance. Hit subscribe and ring that bell so you never miss a new tale. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done at that gate? Until next time, ride on, partner. The frontier's waiting.